about bringing back a species that existed maybe 300 or 400 years ago. Rewilding is also about bringing back the ecosystem. It's a key role, really, that they play in controlling herbivore numbers, in enabling the felt itself and the red grass, very palatable grasses, to actually regenerate themselves as well.
So we need to take a step back and sort of realize that we're a part of nature rather than apart from it.
I'm David Mackenzie off the coastline of Tunisia, and this is CNN.
A very warm welcome to the show, everyone. I'm Isa Suarez. Tonight, the U.S. is at the intersection of two rapidly developing international stories. Just hours ago, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi touched down in Taiwan despite warnings from China. And President Biden authorized a drone strike in Afghanistan that took out the world's most wanted terrorist. But first, China says its military is on high alert and is preparing to take action in response to U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's arrival in Taiwan. While she touched down in the past few hours, saying in a new statement that she wants to reaffirm her unwavering support for democracy there. In Taiwan, the reception was warm and bright, with the iconic Taipei 101 tower lighting up, as you can see there, with messages of support. Pelosi is expected to visit Taiwan's presidential office and parliament. That's expected to happen on Wednesday. But just minutes after she landed, Beijing issued this response, saying these moves, like playing with fire, are extremely dangerous. Those who play with fire will perish by it. Well, as Taiwan ramps up security, Beijing says it will now make a series of, quote, targeted military operations, including joint air and sea drills around the island. Speaking to CNN, China's ambassador to the U.S. said Beijing has the right to defend itself. Have a listen.
Her visit, in whatever form, at whatever time during his tenure, carries high political sensitivities, and it will result in the escalation of the tension. China has every right to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. We are fully justified to do what we must. The current situation is created purely by the US side. So of course, it has to bear the responsibilities.
Well, the White House says Pelosi has every right to visit Taiwan and has urged Beijing not to overreact. But the visit, of course, comes at a time of hugely strained relations between both sides. Celine Wang has more for you.
Destroyers open fire. Missiles launch. Warships shoot into the sea. It's a show of force ahead of China's military anniversary, training for war in the East China and Yellow Seas. Soldiers also recently ran drills around Pingtan Island, China's closest point to Taiwan, just over 77 miles away, renewing fears of a cross-strait crisis, triggered by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to the island.
Good morning.
In a call with President Joe Biden last week, Chinese leader Xi Jinping warned those who play with fire will perish by it. A prominent hawkish voice in China even suggested that if U.S. fighter jets escort Pelosi's plane into Taiwan, China's military should forcibly dispel Pelosi's plane. If ineffective, then shoot them down. The tweet has now been banned. He doesn't represent the official government stance, but state media had been promoting his threat. It's not just that Pelosi is the most powerful U.S. official to visit in 25 years, but Beijing also sees her as a hostile figure. She's been a staunch critic of China for decades. In 1991, 2 years after China's military brutally cracked down on student protesters around Tiananmen Square, Pelosi traveled there and held a banner that read, "To those who died for democracy in China." U.S. President Joe Biden has raised concerns over Pelosi's trip.
The military thinks it's not a good idea right now.
This Chinese state media video says Pelosi is only going to Taiwan to boost her political career, and that America's fragmented government cannot agree on what to do about Taiwan. Neither side can afford to look weak. If Pelosi didn't go, it could look like the U.S. is caving to China's bullying. whereas Xi Jinping is just months away from a key political meeting where he's expected to seek an unprecedented third term.
Given the overreaching that Xi Jinping has been doing, I don't believe we can count on his good judgment.
For now, he's keeping the world guessing as to whether the threats are just bluffing, or if Beijing is actually ready for a crisis that could escalate into a war that no one wants.
Well, CNN's teams are covering all developments on the story. Selena Wang is in Beijing. Kylie Atwood is in New York. Selena, let me start with you. I think it's fair to say, but what we have seen the last few hours, in fact, that Beijing is seething. What has been the reaction from China to Speaker Pelosi's arrival in Taiwan?
Well, seething would be an understatement. They are accusing Pelosi of maliciously provoking China. They see this as undermining China's sovereignty. They have threatened powerful actions, and we are seeing them take some actions. This show of military force that we are seeing was expected. According to Taiwan's defense ministry, they said that China had flown 21 warplanes into Taiwan's air identification defense zone the day Pelosi arrived. This is something that Beijing frequently does and has been regularly doing. We also, according to state media, learned they reported that as Pelosi was arriving, China had sent fighter jets across the Taiwan Strait. In addition to that, after Pelosi's arrival, we heard this statement from China's military saying that this is a serious violation, and they announced a series of military exercises around Taiwan. They said they are on high alert. Now, Beijing is not buying what officials in the U.S. have been repeating. They are saying, look, this is just another regular congressional visit. There's no reason for an overreaction or an escalation. What Beijing sees is a high-profile visit by the person who is second in line to the presidency. And in their view, this is seriously undermining the one China principle that the U.S. had agreed to. So really, the two sides are talking past each other on this point. Of course, at this moment as well, Xi Jinping cannot afford to look weak. So we know that he has to show this show of strength, this show of force, because we're just months away from a key political meeting when he's expected to step into this unprecedented third term. But on the same note, he also needs stability, especially considering all of the problems that you're seeing here at home. So you are also seeing this rhetorical escalation. This is also directed to the domestic audience here as much as it is directed overseas. It is true that 25 years ago, a House Speaker had visited Taiwan, but today's China is vastly different. China now is more powerful in every regard, economically, militarily, and Xi Jinping is China's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong, and he does not take insults or humiliation lightly. But some key questions as we follow Pelosi's visit are what ultimately will be accomplished as a result of this visit? Will Taiwan be more secure or less secure? And how damaging could this be in the long term for U.S.-China relations at a time when there's already so much mutual distrust?
Yeah. Selena, do stay with us. Let me go to Kylie. I mean, Speaker Pelosi, Kylie, has been defending and explaining her visit to Taiwan. In a statement, I saw her op-ed as well in the Washington Post. Tell us what she said and really what she's hoping to get out of this trip.
Well, listen, what she said in that op-ed was pretty clear, saying that Taiwan is plain and simple under threat from the Chinese Communist Party, and the United States, the rest of the world, can't just stand by and watch as that happens. And she laid out her argument for this visit, really citing what China has done to threaten Taiwan, increasingly so over the last few years, talking about the warplanes that have flown into the airspace surrounding Taiwan, talking about cyber attacks, economic efforts to target Taiwan from China. All of those things, she said, make it really an incredibly important time for the Biden administration, for the U.S. government to reiterate their support for Taiwan. Now, of course, some would say that she could do that in statements and the like, but you do have to also take into consideration the fact that she's Speaker of the House. She's not likely to be Speaker of the House next year. So there is a little bit of this calculation for her that is probably related to her personal political legacy on the foreign policy stage, making this visit while she is still Speaker. I also think that it is important to note that the Biden administration has been very clear in expressing their support for Taiwan over the last year. President Biden himself, particularly so, some would say even going a little bit further than the strategic ambiguity that is the U.S. policy towards Taiwan. But what Pelosi said in this Washington Post editorial that came out as soon as she landed on the island was that the Biden administration, Department of Defense officials do expect that China is preparing a contingency to unify Taiwan and China by force. And that is one of the reasons that she felt compelled to make sure that the Taiwanese and China also know just how supported Taiwan is by herself and by the U.S. government with this trip.
Yeah, important context there from Khalil Atwood and from Selena Wang. Appreciate it. Thank you very much, ladies. Well, the United States warns the Taliban could face consequences for harboring Ayman al-Zawahiri, the al-Qaeda leader, who was on the run for decades before he was hunted down and killed. Today, we are learning more about the meticulously planned U.S. operation to assassinate him in Afghanistan. CNN has identified this building as his hideout in downtown Kabul. A senior U.S. official says Zawahiri was standing on a balcony when he was killed in a missile strike over the weekend. The White House released this image of President Joe Biden discussing the top secret operation with aides on July 1st. That locked box you see on the table actually held a small-scale replica of Zawahiri's house, constructed so that President Biden could fully understand his options. While Mr. Biden calls it justice delivered for the families of 9/11, saying Zawahiri was deeply involved in planning the terror attacks. An official tells CNN how the U.S. managed to track him down. Have a listen.
What we were able to do was stitch together some intelligence based on the movements of his family, quite frankly. And then once we tracked them into Kabul, we were able to then be able to track him in his efforts to reunite them. That led then to weeks, if not several months, of making sure that we had the right guy, that this was in fact Mr. Zawahiri, and that this was in fact their residence. And then, of course, developing a pattern of life. His habits, if and when he went outside, how often, on what days, for how long, all that kind of stuff factored into it.
Well, let's get more now from CNN Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr. And Barbara, before we talk about really the significance of his attack, talk to us about the operation itself. You know, the challenge of finding him, tracking him, and killing him in this precision strike.
Well, I suppose in a way it starts really 1 year ago at the end of last August when the U.S. left Afghanistan. No troops on the ground, no planes, no military or publicly acknowledged U.S. personnel inside Afghanistan. That may have led, in fact, to somebody like Zawahiri feeling more comfortable that he could go into Afghanistan, that he could go to Kabul. It was controlled by the Taliban allies, and he may not have felt any threat. So fast forward, around April, the U.S. begins to realize that his family is there, as you heard John Kirby say, and they begin to track Zawahiri's whereabouts. They begin to understand he is in a house in a very well-to-do neighborhood in Kabul, and they continue to track him. The U.S. has not acknowledged and does not say that there were any Americans on the ground as part of this intelligence gathering operation. So we are assuming it was done by drones overhead, possibly communications intercepts, nothing that would involve American government personnel on the ground. And they begin to stitch the picture together. And then it was really last Sunday that President Biden gave the final okay, after he was assured again, apparently, there was very little risk of civilian casualties, and they were absolutely positive they could get their man. Isa?
Thank you very much, Barbara Starr, there for us. Well, let's talk more about the significance of Zawahiri's assassination and what it means for the future of al-Qaeda. I'm joined now by Susanna George, the Afghanistan and Pakistan Bureau Chief for The Washington Post. Susanna, thanks very much for joining us. Talk to us really about how much of a demoralizing blow this is for al-Qaeda.
Well, this is a clear indication that the Taliban are not abiding by the Doha Agreement, which a key part of that agreement was that they would not allow terrorists with international ambitions to live on Afghan soil after the withdrawal of U.S. forces. So this was a key part of the Doha Agreement. It was also a key part of the Biden administration's counterterrorism strategy, this over-the-horizon counterterrorism strategy that rested upon this Taliban commitment to not allow people like Zawahiri to live in central Kabul for months. So that raises a lot of questions about the future of this over-the-horizon counterterrorism strategy, and it gives us a glimpse into what it could look like in the future.
And I suppose it begs the question at this stage, whether really, Susanna, whether this can be, whether the Taliban can be trusted.
Oh, I think it's certainly
the most obvious question.
Yes, it does. I mean, this was a part of Kabul that was incredibly highly secured by the Taliban. The Taliban, for all of their shortcomings in terms of governing, are incredibly good at providing security. This is a place where a lot of NGOs were based, a lot of foreign organizations were based, a lot of senior Taliban leaders. There is no way that Zawahiri was able to live in this area without Taliban acknowledgement and invitation. So that shows that the U.S. Moving forward with their counterterrorism strategy, I mean, we could see, if this continues this way, we could see a series of drone attacks in Afghanistan against terrorist officials like Zawahiri. And is that really what the Biden administration wants the future of their counterterrorism strategy to be in Afghanistan?
I want to play, Senator, a little clip of what John Kirby said exactly about that, the violation of the Doha Agreement that took months and months to agree upon. Let's listen to this.
We've made it very clear that this was a violation, not that we believe, not that we think, it was a violation of the Doha Agreement, which specifically says and commits them to not allowing Afghanistan to be used as a safe haven or launching pad for attacks against the United States or other of our allies and partners. And clearly, because Mr. Zawahiri was not only there, but was actively encouraging his followers to plot and plan attacks against the American interest and the American homeland, that's a violation.
How do you think, then, Senator, will this shift any sort of relationship, of discourse or communication that the U.S. may have with the Taliban here?
I spoke to a Taliban intelligence official, and what he said and what the Taliban have said for months now is, yes, there are people with links to Al-Qaeda who are in Afghanistan. They say these people are not operational. They're not planning operations, and so that actually does not violate the Doha Agreement. Obviously, the United States does not agree with that. But he defended Zawahiri's presence because he said that he was there with his family as a refugee from Pakistan. He had moved over from Pakistan, and that he was not actively planning any operations against the U.S. or U.S. interests overseas. And so it actually was not a violation.
But very quickly, are you surprised at just how the attack unfolded, the fact that he was caught really in his veranda so brazenly and so specifically and so targeted?
I'm not surprised. What I am surprised by is how long it took to coordinate this attack in a way that minimized civilian casualties. This was a months-long operation that the Biden administration admitted. And so we can see that this over-the-horizon counterterrorism operations, they're not going to be quick responses. These are going to be long planned operations.
But then I suppose it begs the question whether the US can keep up this level of vigilance, intelligence, resources in the long haul.
Exactly. If there are not US assets on the ground in Afghanistan, and the U.S. is going to rely almost entirely on aerial surveillance in order to conduct counterterrorism operations, that's a very serious question.
Susanna George, really appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming in. Well, Zawahiri may have been infamous, of course, for his role in September 11th. He declared war on the United States as far back as 1998. Michael Holmes traces the roots of Zawahiri's long links to terror.
We want to speak to the whole world. Who are we? Who are we?
By the time Ayman al-Zawahiri burst onto the world scene after the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, he was already a terrorist, committed to turning Egypt into a fundamentalist Islamic state. The young doctor came from one of Egypt's leading families, There is even an al-Zawahiri street in Cairo named after his grandfather. His uncle described him as pious.
He was known that he is a good Muslim who is keen to pray at time in the mosque and to read and to think and to have his own decisions.
Al-Zawahiri spent 3 years in prison after Sadat's assassination. After he got out, he made his way to Pakistan, where he used his medical skills to treat those fighting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. That's where he met Osama bin Laden, and they found a common cause. He talked about it a decade later.
We are working with Brother bin Laden. We know him since more than 10 years. We have fought with him here in Afghanistan, and we are working with him in Sudan and in many other places.
Al-Zawahiri was many places in the early 1990s, even, it's believed, visiting California on a false passport. His group attacked Egyptian embassies and tried to kill Egyptian politicians. Eventually, Al-Zawahiri folded his group into Al-Qaeda.
Zawahiri pretty much led the group. He did the strategic policy of what Al-Qaeda's agenda was. Certainly bin Laden gave his authority and blessings to it, but Al-Zawahiri called the shots.
Al-Zawahiri was at bin Laden's side when he declared war on America in May 1998. Weeks later, they launched an attack on US embassies in Africa and then gloated after they escaped a US cruise missile attack launched in retaliation. After the 9/11 attacks, Al-Zawahiri began to become the voice of Al-Qaeda, taunting the US.
American people, you must ask yourselves, why all this hate against America?
After the US invasion of Afghanistan, bin Laden and Al-Zawahiri were on the run, sometimes together, more often apart. His wife and daughters were killed in a US airstrike aimed at him. But he continued to issue messages on subjects ranging from the war in Iraq to the London subway attacks in 2005. And while he was always the likely choice to succeed Osama bin Laden, it took the organization several weeks to announce his promotion.
Zawahiri is not charismatic. He was not involved in the fight earlier on in Afghanistan. And I think he has a lot of detractors within the organization. And I think you're going to see them start eating themselves from within more and more.
Without bin Laden, Al-Qaeda can never be the same.
It's an idea personified by Osama bin Laden. He was this charismatic figure. To join Al-Qaeda, you pledged a personal oath to him. People went and died, not for Ayman Zawahiri or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but for Osama bin Laden.
Terror experts say that to jihadists worldwide, Al-Qaeda still has great appeal as an inspiration. And while Al-Zawahiri was an obvious successor to bin Laden, it's not at all clear who would succeed Al-Zawahiri.
And still to come tonight, there's fierce fighting in Ukraine. We'll take a look at the front lines and tell you who's making gains and at what cost. That is next.
It is hard to imagine life returning here even when the shelling stops, which it does not. You can see the almost impossible job of policing this fenceless border. What would be the consequence? An all-out war. This has been a hasty move, make no doubt about it. Tension mounting here, the shields have gone back up. This crisis, all created by the mad policies of a government. Why did you think an assassination plot was necessary? It's extraordinary to stand exactly where ISIS may, in fact, have been plotting attacks. There is growing fear about what lies ahead. These apocalyptic sites are warnings about the climate crisis. It's right here and right now. Nick Peyton Walsh, CNN.
The data shows that the Caribbean and Latin America have some of the highest rates of sex crimes in the world, and sex crimes ties into human trafficking. My name is Jonathan Bagan. I'm based in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm an attorney at law and also chairman of the Caribbean Committee Against Sex Crimes. Say 10 years ago, it was said, even in my country, that nobody should speak out about human trafficking because they will come to get you, the mafia. Now that hundreds of people know about it and are speaking out against it, that darkness has been destroyed, and now we're bringing the issue into the light. Schools across Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, the students were really positive about it. They wrote poems, spoken word poems, they made videos.
I've risen and believed.
And those videos went on to the local media, onto the radio and television.
On arrival, you are forced into captivity and a life of servitude.
So the students were inspired to see their fellow students being connected to CNN International. A lot of kids now know the signs of human trafficking, what it is and how to avoid it. So we may have saved some lives. My Freedom Day helped raise awareness, educate children, and I hope it inspires politicians and the governments across the region to do more to stop this crime from happening. It's impactful and important, and we hope to do even better next year.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. Russia is bearing down on eastern Ukraine with intense shelling. That is according to Ukrainian forces. They say Russian troops are targeting civilian infrastructure in the Donetsk region, but Ukrainian military officials say they have repelled Russian advances. They have also started the mandatory evacuation of civilians in Donetsk. Meanwhile, Ukraine warns Russia is sending more troops as well as equipment to Kherson, that is in the south. Well, I'm joined now by Neil Melvin, Director of International Security Studies at RUSI, a British defence and security think tank. Neil, thank you very much for joining us. Let's start off with the front lines. It seems that we have various front lines now. What started in the east, we now have the south. Talk us through the state of play as you see it right now, 6 months in.
Yeah, well, I mean, really, it's a very critical moment, I think, in the war in which we're seeing a transition in the fighting. The war's gone through really 3 phases. The first phase was very much focused on the battle for Kiev. We saw that in February and March. Then it moved into the Donbass area. And now we're seeing fighting spreading and really being focused around the southern area as Ukraine is seeking to push the Russian forces back. And so this is a new development emerging.
Let's focus on Kherson. This is a bigger picture of what we saw in Kherson. The last few days, as you're saying, we've seen heavy shelling in Mykolaiv, Kryvyi Rih as well, as, of course, as you're saying, the Ukrainians are trying to regain that ground and trying to push the Russian forces out. How do you see that movement? Do you think they can achieve this by September, as the Ukrainians were suggesting?
Well, what Ukraine is trying to do now is in the months up to the winter to really push back into this territory that Russia grabbed from February onwards. And Kherson is the key initial strategic point. It's the only city that the Russians managed to seize in the war so far. But also all these Russian forces to try and trap them west of the Dnieper River, which is just here, and cut them off. If Ukraine can do that, of course, it'll be a big strategic victory. It'll be the first time that the Russians have been defeated in the war, and also that territory is being regained.
And just explain why the Dnieper River is so important, how the Russians were using it here.
Well, in the initial phases of the war, the Russians were hoping to push across Ukraine to the west, and the Dnieper River really divides Ukraine between east and west. It's a natural barrier. So the fact that the Ukrainians are able to push them back and then potentially even push into this area, which would be at the heartland of Russian gains, that would count as a massive victory if the Ukrainians could do that.
How much have the HIMARS really played a part in the Ukrainian battle in pushing the Russians back here? Specifically, and we've seen that mostly in Kherson, I believe.
Well, the HIMARS, these are the multiple rocket systems that the West has been provided in various formats. But what they've allowed the Ukrainians to do is really undermine what the Russian advantage was. In the battle for Donbass, they had massive artillery advantages.
Yeah, this is Donbass,
the Ukrainians have been targeting the arms supplies, the operating forward bases of the Russians and the infrastructure. So the Russians now have lost that artillery advantage, and they've been very accurate, the Ukrainians, in taking this out. So now we see that there's been a massive drop-off in Russian artillery activity. They're not able to play that card anymore, and this is why the Ukrainians are now beginning to be able to push them back.
And give us as an idea, obviously, the Dnieper River's played a huge part in how the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back. But how effective, I mean, what measures are we seeing? How clever are the Russians becoming in trying to control, you think, trying to take control of Kherson?
Well, the HIMARS and the whole now shift in the dynamic of the conflict is seeing the Russians have to change their tactics. They have to disperse their forces in a way we haven't seen before, and they're having to dig in and defend. And this is going to be what's going to characterize the next phase of the war, which is the Russians trying to build defenses in the south to bring their forces down to the south, and the Ukrainians trying to break through with their NATO-supplied weapons.
Let's have a focus then on really how this war started, and it started on the Eastern Front. How do you see this battle? I mean, are we at a stalemate here?
Well, the peak of the Russian success was really in June and July, in which they managed to push into this Luhansk region and take most of it, take a couple of key cities here, northern Donetsk, Severodonetsk. Now we see that the Russians are not really making very much progress at all, a few hundred meters each day.
Why is that then, Neil?
A big factor is the Western weapons, but also the Russians they're starting to run out of fresh troops. Their troops have been in the field since February. They haven't done a mass mobilization, so they're not being able to pull in large numbers. They're bringing in some private contractors, but they haven't got the troops that would allow them to break through anymore.
Yeah, we're starting to see evacuations from President Zelensky. I want to get here back to the main map for our viewers. These is where the battles now are being fought. Your view now, where this could go next, the final. Obviously, this is here. Then now they're trying to take the south. Where should we be looking to next, would you say, Neil?
Well, this is going to be the centre of activity here, focused on Kherson, but also into Zaporizhia here. But the conflict will also carry on in Donbass, because as the Russians are moving their forces south to try and block the Ukrainians will look for opportunities also to push back into the Donbass, where they've lost some territory. So it's going to be quite a dynamic battlefield over the next 4 months up to the winter, but the south is really where the battles are going to be decided.
Right, so that's the next phase of this war. Neil Melvin, really appreciate you taking time. Thank you very much. And still to come right here on the show, Beijing vows targeted military operations as Nancy Pelosi arrives in Taiwan. We take a look at tonight's top story. That's next.
Check this out.
It hasn't been such a long time since people first started shopping online, and it was easy to keep up with the clicks. Little by little by little by more, the clicks added up to be more than the stores, and e-tailers worked harder than ever before, because they had to keep up with the clicks. All of a sudden, there are so many must-dos if you want to keep selling, like delivery there, no there, or there.
And make it tomorrow, first thing.
No time for borders. Gotta stay in control to stay in the flow and continue to grow. But we'll help you. Keep up with the clicks.
Transformation, technology, new Marketplace Europe.
From the meteoric leap of 5G to a deep dive into the metaverse, how Europe is investing in its telecom sector.
Marketplace Europe, Saturday on CNN.
Hadas Gold in Jerusalem, and this is CNN.
Welcome back, everyone. While China is vowing targeted military operations in response to U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei, Pelosi arrived just hours ago visiting Taiwan, despite warnings by both Washington as well as Beijing. Pelosi says the trip is intended to reaffirm support for democracy on the island. Well, let's explore the ramifications of this visit. Robert Daly is director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S. and joins us now from Washington, D.C. Robert, thank you very much for joining us. I just want to read out a statement really for our viewers that we received from Beijing, that Beijing issued, in fact, just minutes after Pelosi landed, which says, "These moves, like playing with fire, are extremely dangerous. Those who play with fire will perish by it." More fiery rhetoric, as you can see there from Beijing, or is there a risk, Robert, that this could escalate?
There is a risk always. I think it's unlikely in this case. When Beijing speaks of targeted military action, they probably don't mean something targeted at human beings or at other military assets. And they may not mean an action taken while Speaker Pelosi is in Taiwan. Beijing can take its time. They can act at a moment of their choosing that they think will be most efficacious for them. But this could include things like live missile exercises where the missiles fall into the water, or flying closer to Taiwan than it has previously. The language sounds murderous. The action could escalate, but is unlikely to be something fatal.
And, you know, in the meantime, we have heard from Speaker Pelosi. She issued a statement today. She also put an op-ed in Washington Post when she landed, where she has been defending and explaining her visit to what she says promote, obviously, democratic values. Do you think that she needed to go to show this solidarity with Taiwan? Was this trip needed?
I don't think it was a necessary trip. We have been sending more assets, more leaders to Taiwan. We have been helping them to gain more international space. We have been receiving Taiwanese officials at a higher level in the United States. And I think that that is all fine. There's a good reason to do that. I don't believe that the Pelosi visit adds any reassurance to Taiwan, but I think that it does provoke Beijing. Her justification further in the Washington Post is a little strange. She says that the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 set out America's commitment to a democratic Taiwan. That's wrong. Taiwan was not a democracy at the time. It was a one-party dictatorship, and the Taiwan Relations Act makes no mention of democracy. And so we have both from Beijing in its way and from Washington in its way a reinterpretation or a conflation of some of the documents that had been seen as the foundation of peace in the Taiwan Strait. That foundation appears to be eroding.
So how much then, Robert, is this trip about optics and not giving in to China more than policy at this stage?
Well, the justification most often heard in Washington is that the trip should be made to show Beijing that we will not back down from its threats. But that's a second-order concern. These threats wouldn't have existed if the trip hadn't been planned. So we're making a trip in order to assert our right to make a trip, even if it doesn't, in fact, advance American interests. Great powers get into these kinds of escalatory games. What's concerning is that our energies are going into this kind of mutual testing rather than into the kinds of dialogues we need to get a little bit more stability in the area and to try to manage U.S.-China relations well, even as that relationship gets more fraught and more contentious.
Like you said, I think it's, you know, there's so much mistrust. The relations between U.S. and China are already quite strained. How do you think this will impact, then, Robert, this relationship?
I think the long-term impact of the Pelosi visit will be negative all around. In in mainland China, coming after the trade war and all of the friction over COVID, this will cement in the minds of Chinese policymakers and the Chinese public that the United States is simply opposed to China's rise, that it wants to constrain China and keep it down. In the United States, and I think in much of the rest of the world, you know, Beijing's really bellicose, over-the-top rhetoric that you started out by quoting is going to cement the idea that China is a dangerous new power, that it is a bully, and that it doesn't always play in accordance with international best practices. Beijing doesn't come out of this looking good.
Obviously, we're focusing on US, we're focusing on China, but let's not forget Taiwan. Do you fear, Robert, this could ramp up China's military as well, economic coercion of Taiwan? Does it put Taiwan at risk here?
Beijing has been coercing Taiwan heavily since Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen was elected about 7 years ago. They've been ramping up military pressure. They've been isolating it internationally, particularly in the economic sphere. And I think that things will be slightly worse because of the Pelosi visit. China will take some new military action that it hasn't taken previously. They've promised us that. And that will set a precedent. That will establish a new baseline. So they will be essentially pushing a pawn toward greater intimidation of Taiwan. That's just because of the Pelosi visit. Aside from the Pelosi visit, U.S.-China relations continue to deteriorate in almost every track, and that too is going to put more pressure on Taiwan.
Such important insight and context. Robert Daly, really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.
And still to come tonight, Brittany Griner's trial in Russia continues. The American athlete's first court appearance since we learned about a potential prisoner swap. We have the details next.
Sodexo was created more than 50 years ago by my father, Pierre Bellon. And it's a global catering company and services company all over the world. We have fans in stadium, we have visitors in a museum, we have guests in the conference centers, and Sodexo Life is there to make memorable experiences to all these people. I think it's very important to work with people. We have to work in team spirit. This is very important to engage them. Team spirit, team of progress. I think it's very, very spirit of progress is very important. We have to every day do better than the day before. You know, this is important, and also spirit of growth. This is important too.
Out front tonight, a potential breakthrough in treating coronavirus.
We've gotten very little help from the federal government.
Could all this spending lead to a bigger economic crisis? One of our viewers saw you last night on the show. She says she's going to pay your rent this month. Shut up. I want to go now to an incredible story of survival. Would you do it all again in terms of being a nurse, knowing that that could put you at risk for this?
I want to help people more than I ever have.
Aaron Burnett out front on CNN.
Well, a ship carrying Ukrainian grain has just anchored in Turkish waters. The ship left Odessa on Monday carrying 27,000 tons of corn. Its passage was delayed due to bad weather. It will now be inspected by Turkish officials, then will head off to Lebanon. And of course, this is the first shipment of grain to leave Ukraine since Russia invaded. We'll keep on top of that story for you. Now, American basketball star Brittany Griner was back in court a short time ago. She's detained in Russia on drug possession charges. This was her 7th hearing and her first appearance since we learned that the White House was offering to exchange a Russian arms dealer for her and another US citizen. If convicted, Griner could face 10 years in prison. She's set to return to court later this week. CNN's Fred Blyken spoke with her lawyer. Have a listen.
Tell me how Brittany is doing now ahead of this court date, because she said she's a bit nervous but also quite focused. Is that correct?
She's still focused and she's still nervous and she still knows that the end is near. And of course she heard the news, so she she's hoping that sometime she could be coming home, and we hope too.
Fred Pleiken joins me now live from Moscow. Fred, so she's focused but still nervous. Give us a sense of what happened today. What did we hear crucially from this expert witness, Fred?
Yeah, well, certainly there's a sense that this trial is going to be coming to an end very soon, and you can really feel how Brittany Griner obviously is becoming more and more focused and somewhat nervous as the final days of this trial move on. Today, what the defense did is they really, as part of their broader strategy, they called an expert witness who sort of tried to cast doubt on some of the original forensics that were done on those vaping cartridges that Brittany Griner has admitted to having had with her as she tried to enter Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport on February 17th, saying that some of the analysis was done, was apparently, as they put it, not done in a scientific way. Apparently, there were some serial numbers that were not put in a certain form. So in any case, they are trying to cast some doubt on some of the forensics and the quantity of THC that might have been inside those vaping cartridges. And that's really part of the larger strategy, Issa, that we've been seeing from the defense, where on the one hand, Brittany Griner has, of course, pleaded guilty. She has shown remorse. She has said that she accidentally packed those vaping cartridges and did not mean to break Russian law. But at the same time, they also try to cast some of doubt on some of the things that were in those initial findings when Brittany Griner was detained. She's also, of course, had some character witnesses as well, testifying to the fact that, of course, she's done a lot for basketball around the world, but specifically in Russia. And she also said during her testimony that it was very important for her to be back in Russia and to be with her teammates. All of this, as the defense, as they once again said today, is looking for leniency. We know that Russian courts have an extremely high rate of conviction, well over 90%. So essentially, if they don't get her acquitted, they do at least want a fairly lenient sentence. And you know, the defense team believes that they've so far done as well as they possibly could under these circumstances. And now they say, of course, it's up to the courts to decide things. So the next trial date is on Thursday. But Brittany Griner's legal team told us today that they believe that not only closing arguments could happen on Thursday, but we might actually also have a verdict. So this trial could be coming to an end very soon. Obviously, very important times. Also, as that possible prisoners exchange is also being discussed, Issa.
Yeah, on that, where are we on the negotiation front about this potential prison exchange that we heard about last week from Secretary Blinken? How much, crucially, does this loom large over this trial, Fred?
Yeah, I think loom large is exactly the right word. It definitely looms large over this trial. However, of course, right now it's not clear whether or not there's actually active negotiations going on, whether or not the U.S. and Russia are even engaged at this point in time, or whether it's some sort of waiting game that is going on. We did ask today also the defense team about that as well, and they said they're not aware of any negotiations. They've not heard about any negotiations. They've heard, from the media that the U.S. obviously came out and said that they'd made this substantial offer, not just for Brittany Griner, but of course also for Paul Whelan, the former Marine who's been sentenced to 16 years here in Russia on alleged espionage charges, which he denies. Brittany Griner's team says they believe that in order for an exchange to take place, there needs to be a verdict in her trial first. So that's something that they say is very important. So we're going to wait and see how that plays out, but presumably a verdict would have to happen first.
Yeah, and perhaps, like you said, it could happen as early as Thursday. Fred Pleiken, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks, Fred. And still to come tonight, America goes to the polls as primary season heats up. We'll go live to Arizona, where some candidates are causing concern. We'll explain next.
Air Quality Update, in association with Copernicus, Europe's Eyes on Earth. Air Quality Update in association with Copernicus, Europe's Eyes on Earth.
Our mission here at CNN and journalists, the news comes first. That's when your heart beats a little bit faster. More breaking news that we are following right now. You really work as hard as you can, getting the facts. We're learning more about our life plot. It is critically important. To our viewers in the United States and around the world, welcome to the Situation Room. We have breaking news.
Welcome back. Now, a federal judge has handed down the stiffest sentence we've seen so far given to a January 6th rioter. Guy Reffitt has been sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the insurrection. It comes nearly 20 months after he brought a gun to the Capitol and made threatening comments about House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Back in March, Reffitt was convicted of 5 felonies. And it seems his actions and punishment are dividing his family. Here's his daughter's reaction.
To mark my dad as this horrible person, and then having him prosecuted like this when somebody is maybe even able to get elected again, doesn't seem right to me.
Trump deserves life in prison if my father's in prison for this long.
And there was some even harsher words from his wife.
No matter if you're a liberal, if you're an independent, if you're a Republican, this is not okay. This is what this is political persecution. We are patriots. Ashley Babbitt was a patriot. My husband is a patriot. Roseanne Boylan was a patriot. And all I can say is that y'all can all go to hell and I'm going back to Texas.
But Guy Reffitt's son, Jackson, is taking a very different approach. Here's what he told CNN earlier.
I don't view this as a political matter. This is more of what is morally correct and how to go about it. This isn't half a matter of a political opinion. What my father did is far from politics. This is completely off the rails violence. It's more about what he did and who he did it for.
Well, Jackson warned the FBI about his father before and after the insurrection. And this is all happening as America gears up for primary season. Voters in 5 states head to the polls later today, and all eyes are on Arizona as the Republicans pick a Senate candidate to challenge incumbent Democrat Mark Kelly. As the Capitol rioters are sentenced for their part in the insurrection, fueled by the belief, of course, the election was stolen, many of the contenders on the Republican ballot are election deniers. CNN's Kyung Lajos is now live from a polling station in Phoenix, Arizona. And Kyung, you know, the governor's race is almost really, as we outlined there, a proxy battle between former President Donald Trump and his Vice President Mike Pence. So who is likely to win? And what does that crucially tell us, Kyung, about the future of the Republican Party?
Well, let's start with who they're going to the polls to vote for. We'll start there, Issa. I'm at a polling place, and the races that we're specifically watching are happening on the Republican Party side. That's where the heated contests are happening. And we're specifically looking at the top state administrator in Arizona, which is the governor. And there are 2 candidates who are battling it out as frontrunners. The Trump-backed Kari Lake. She is a former TV newscaster. She is well known in the Phoenix metro area, and she has been backed by Donald Trump. She is an election denier. She's made it the centerpiece of her candidacy. She is facing a candidate who Mike Pence and Arizona's governor Doug Ducey has backed, Karen Taylor Robson. They are, by many state polls, difficult to tell who exactly is in the lead. There are a lot of different methodologies with state polling. It's very difficult to tell, but